Most of us have seen our share of phishing scams. They land in our inboxes, our texts, even our phone calls. Someone is trying to get us to click on a link or give up personal information. And by now, we might think we're pretty good at identifying and avoiding them. But a new report from the University of Toronto's Citizen Lab uncovered a phishing campaign that is much more sophisticated. And international intelligence believes the group behind it is linked to Russia's security service. So today, we're speaking with the Globe's Alexandra Posadzki. She'll tell us what Citizen Lab found, how this phishing campaign works, and what we know about the mysterious group that's behind it. I'm Menaka Raman-Wilms, and this is The Decibel from the Globe and Mail. Alex, great to have you back.
Thanks so much for having me.
So what was actually in last week's report from Citizen Lab?
So what Citizen Lab, along with their research partners, including Access Now, has done is they've found what they call a spear phishing campaign, so a sophisticated cyber attack, essentially, and they've managed to link it to this group called Cold River, which is sort of a notorious Russian-linked hacking group. And so what they go through in this report is, how these hacks occur, how they manage to link them to Cold River, and then also the fact that along with Access Now, they've actually managed to identify what appears to be a whole new threat actor, which they have nicknamed Cold Wastrel.
Wow. Okay, so there's a lot here. We're going to get into Cold River, Cold Wastrel, what's actually involved in this spear phishing attack. But let's just kind of lay out, this report is from a group called Citizen Lab. This is out of the University of Toronto. Just briefly, Alex, who is this group? What do they do? How do they operate?
So Citizen Lab, they're a lab essentially based out of UFT's Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy, and they do research on sort of things at the intersection of information and communication technologies, human rights, and global security. And, they're funded by various foundations, and so they've done a lot of research specifically looking at different cyber attack campaigns and linking them to sort of state actors around the world.
Okay, so let's actually get into these hacking attacks then that they were looking at. Can we start by talking about the people, I guess, that they were targeting? So who were these attacks actually targeting?
So the one common thread between all of these attacks is essentially some kind of connection to Russia, Belarus, or Ukraine. And what they found is that the attackers were targeting people who are seen to be enemies of the Russian state. And so they could be, for example, Russian opposition figures who are living in exile. In one case, they went after a former U.S. ambassador to Ukraine, Stephen Pfeiffer, who is now working at a U.S. think tank. A lot of the victims that they were targeting actually chose to remain confidential in order to sort of protect their privacy and their security. But a few of them did come forward, including an investigative journalism group out of Russia that has done a lot of high-profile investigations into Russian state corruption.
Do we know, Alex, what the hackers were trying to gain?
Essentially, what they're trying to do through these attacks is get the target's credentials to be able to log into their email account. And so they're looking at people who have a lot of connections in these sort of sensitive communities. So, for example, Russian dissidents. And so then they're able to get into their email accounts and presumably pull out some kind of intel or, use access to that person's email account to then go after and target people that they have contacts to.
Okay. And you used the term spear phishing a little earlier to describe these attacks. So explain what that means. How does this attack actually work?
Yeah, so spear phishing is a type of phishing, and phishing is a social engineering attack. So what that means is that it's essentially trying to trick people into doing something, so revealing sensitive information or perhaps installing malware onto their devices. And spear phishing is a more advanced form of phishing. And so whereas phishing, we all get phishing emails. It's someone saying, hey, this is Amazon, your delivery is delayed. Click here and log into your Amazon account to track it. Or this is your bank, please insert your banking information because someone's compromised your bank account or what have you. So spear phishing is much more targeted and specific. And so rather than sending out these emails to large swaths of the population, they're actually going after very specific individuals. And so what we saw in these attacks is a lot of research that the attackers are doing into their targets. They're figuring out what kind of work they're doing, what they're interested in. And they're sending out these emails impersonating people that the targets know personally.
Wow.
And they're doing it in such a convincing manner that in some cases the targets actually thought that they were communicating with the person who was being impersonated.
So they've gathered all this intel, like you said, they do research on who this person is, who they might be working with or communicating with, and then they impersonate someone that they think that individual will know then.
Exactly. So in the example of a media organization, it might look like them finding out who your editor is and pretending to be your editor and saying, hey, I have the edits on your latest story. Can you please review these? And then there's an attachment, which is a PDF. And when you open that PDF, it looks like, or it's mimicking what the target might think is an encrypted file. And it's saying, this is an encrypted file. Please click here to decrypt. And it's when you click that it then takes you to a website that looks like your email server. So it mimics Gmail or Proton Mail or whatever email server you use. And then it asks you to put in your username and your password. And so that information is then being sent to the hackers, and then they can use it to essentially log into your email. And they've even found ways to bypass two-factor authentication.
Wow. It really does seem like this group, Cold River, these hacking attacks are finding ways to get their target's guard down and trust, I guess, the person who's supposedly sending this email. So how do they build that trust? Like, how do they establish that with their target?
Well, actually, one of the really frightening things that came out of this report is that in some cases, they're actually not even sending the document right away. So, we've all, of course, been trained to look for emails with attachments that we're not expecting, unsolicited attachments. We're all on high alert for them. But in some cases, they're actually establishing contact and trying to develop trust and communication with the target before they even send the PDF, or maybe they're pretending to forget the PDF. And so they've seen in some cases the target themselves asking for the attachment.
Wow.
And so at that point, it's no longer an unsolicited attachment. It's something that is actually being solicited by the target. And so they're much more likely to fall for it, essentially.
Yeah, there's like, this person, you're working with this person, so you're trusting that what you're getting from them is real. Mm-hmm. Let's actually dig into the group that's behind these phishing attacks then. Who is Cold River?
Yeah, so Cold River's actually been reported on quite extensively over the past several years. And there's this advisory from a group of cybersecurity and intelligence agencies from each of the Five Eyes intelligence countries. And so the Five Eyes, of course, are Canada, the US, Britain, Australia, and New Zealand.
It's basically like a security network. They share information.
Yeah. Exactly. And so they've put out this advisory where they've actually said that Cold River is almost certainly doing hacking on behalf of the Russian FSB. And so the Russian intelligence agency. And they've actually specifically linked it to a sector of the FSB.
Wow. And I understand, too, that there was a whole bunch of different names, but we think now this is all the same group. Can you just, I guess, walk me through that and how we understand how this is working?
So essentially, there's different groups that have been doing research into this threat actor. And so they've all given them a different nickname. So some call them Star Blizzard, some call them Callisto Group or Blue Callisto. At one point, they were referred to as Seaborgium. And what has come out of all of these different attempts at researching this threat actor is they all kind of are, using the same tactics and the same technology. And so these research groups, when they dig into them, they can identify that it appears to be the same threat actor.
We'll be back after this message. Of course, Citizen Lab studies lots of different cybersecurity issues, threats. What did they say was particularly notable about this one? Why is this something that, people are paying attention to?
Well, what's really kind of unsettling about it from the perspective of one of the Citizen Lab senior researchers that I spoke to is that in spite of all this publicity and all of this press that this group has gotten over recent years, they're actually still persisting in their attacks, which is quite bold. They haven't stopped. They haven't really changed up their tactics. They're actually kind of still out there doing their thing, even though there's quite a bit of awareness about them now.
Wow. How does this fit into the larger history of Russian cyber espionage?
Well, Russian cyber espionage has been going on for decades, and it's undertaken by multiple state security agencies and sometimes actually with the participation of organized crime groups or private sector entities. And it's actually not even the first time that Citizen Lab has done a report on this. For example, in 2017, they published this report talking about a hack that was sort of Russian aligned, which they referred to as tainted leaks. And it was also looking into a phishing operation that had targeted 200 different people across 39 countries. And some of the targets included government officials, military officials, CEOs of energy companies. So obviously not the first time that a Russian state organization or state agency has done this, and not the first time the Citizen Lab has looked into it.
And way earlier in our conversation, Alex, you mentioned that Citizen Lab also identified another threat actor. So can we talk about that? What else did they find?
So what happened here is actually this other group called Access Now had been contacted by various people who had been targeted by a spear phishing campaign. And they thought maybe at first that it was also Cold River. And when they started digging into these attacks, they actually found that while the tactics that were being used were very similar to Cold River's tactics, there were actually some notable differences. And so what the researchers at Citizen Lab and Access Now have determined is that this is very likely a separate threat actor. It could also perhaps be an existing threat actor that's kind of decided to switch up their tactics, but there were enough differences there that they don't think that this is part of the River of Phish campaign, as Citizen Lab has called it, that is associated with Cold River that they're studying here. They think it's potentially a separate threat actor. And so some of the differences that they found were, for example, the version of PDFs that were being used, the links that were being used were, distinct links with the River of Phish campaign versus using the same link for this new threat actor. And also, I think the language was different. So English in the River of Phish campaign versus Russian in this other campaign by this threat actor that they have dubbed Cold Wastrel.
Huh. I think what a lot of us may be thinking about is, of course, the U.S. election is coming up, right? We've seen before, interference in attempted interference in a lot of elections as well. Is there any indication that a group like this might attempt to target the election?
I think when you have something as politically charged and high stakes as a U.S. election, you are going to see more phishing attacks, more spear phishing attacks, more disinformation campaigns. And so I think it would be prudent for us all to be on the lookout for those sorts of things, especially people who work in media, people in positions of political authority, and people who are vulnerable to these type of attacks. Because, one of the things that comes up in this report is that a lot of the targets in this campaign, if they were infiltrated successfully, it could be really risky for them. Some of them are, perhaps Russian opposition figures or Russian media organizations who are actually still living in Russia. And so for them to be compromised, it could potentially result in physical harm and violence and imprisonment. And so it's really high stakes for some of these targets.
Yeah, I mean, I'm glad you brought that up because we briefly kind of talked about the people that have been targeted by this group. But for a lot of them, it sounds like there are some really severe consequences potentially for being hacked in this way.
Yeah, absolutely. And, maybe not the same level of resources that targets in the U.S. would have.
Yeah. Just lastly here, Cold River's targets seem to be quite specific. I guess just broadly, though, if people are concerned about this kind of phishing, as you said, all of us do see these phishing attempts from different actors. I guess what can we do to protect ourselves? What are the kinds of things we should really look out for?
Yeah, so they do in this report kind of list a number of steps that people can take to protect themselves. One of them, of course, is using two-factor authentication. And specifically, they recommend not using SMS or text messages for your two-factor authentication, but setting up an authenticator app. So that's going to provide a greater level of security. There's also other things you can do. So if you get an email from someone that is asking you to open an attachment, you should check your inbox for that person's email address and see whether the email you've received most recently, whether the address is exactly the same as maybe past emails that you've received from that person. So is there that one letter of misspelling or an extra period or something that would suggest that maybe the person sending you the email is not actually the person that you think that it is? You can connect with that person via a different medium, so a phone call or a text message. Another thing that was really interesting about these attacks is they actually seem to be capitalizing on a lack of understanding of how encryption works, because these PDFs that people would open, they would show this kind of blurred text. And then over top of it would be like, click to decrypt. And apparently just the actual visual appearance of it is very, very different from an actual encryption service. And so a lot of the people who were being targeted, they didn't necessarily know how a file would actually look if it were encrypted. So like, according to this report, that blurred text, like that's not how it would appear. So, you know, maybe familiarizing yourself with encryption technology would be a good step. And, you know, they suggest like just not clicking. Don't open the document. Oh, and then, of course, you know, if you use a service like Gmail, you can actually go in and check the access logs to see sort of when your account was accessed and whether, you know, it looks like somebody other than you was logging into your account. And so there's, you know, a bunch of different things that you can do. But the key takeaway really is just to remain vigilant and on the lookout. You know, I think what really took people by surprise here is just the level of sophistication to these attacks, right? Because it's, you know, we all know what a phishing email looks like. We get all of that corporate training to help us sort of identify phishing emails, but we're not necessarily used to somebody who is, you know, puts so much research and time and energy into impersonating someone that we know, someone who knows what we're working on. And so I think we need to just be more vigilant than ever and not assume that the person you're corresponding with, especially if they're trying to get you to open a PDF and review a document, that they're actually who they say they are. And so we need to be a little bit suspicious, and maybe it feels a little bit extra sometimes to be that suspicious of people you're communicating with, but better safe than sorry.
Alex, always great to have you here. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
That's it for today. I'm Menaka Raman-Wilms. Our producers are Madeline White, Rachel Levy-McLaughlin, and Michal Stein. David Crosby edits the show. Adrian Chung is our senior producer, and Matt Frainer is our managing editor. Thanks so much for listening, and I'll talk to you tomorrow.